Hey, hello everyone, welcome back to Talking Tuesdays. Today I'm here with Greg Kasavin. He is the creative director over at Supergiant Games, known for Bastion, Transistor, and Pyre. How you doing, Greg?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. I'm actually on my spring break right now, but I'm really excited to be doing this interview. What I want to first start with, and especially just because it's the most recent thing, how are you feeling now that Pyre is how many months out?
Oh man, it's been so it came out at the end of July last year. So it's been a good number of months. I'm finally think I've finally sort of recovered from the initial launch. There's a lot of work that goes into the last kind of, you've probably heard before, the last few weeks and months of the development of a game. Things get particularly busy.
Yeah, I mean, I can only imagine how difficult it is and how long the process is afterwards.
Yeah, then from there, not only so Pyre took us about 3 years to make, and so not only are we kind of continuing to support the game for the weeks and even months after the initial launch, it's also just kind of like recharging your batteries and starting to think about what's next and all that kind of good stuff. We still had to do some. Even after the initial launch, we localized Pyre into a bunch of different languages like Chinese and Russian and Spanish and so on. And it's a pretty kind of story-rich game, so there was like a lot of content to go through to get all the translation and stuff done. So yeah, we kept pretty busy even after the game came out.
Now, is that where the bulk of the work goes into? Because I've played the games before, and they're very, very story-driven, especially Pyre. And so is that why this game took so long and why it's continuing to have so much work put forth into it?
Yeah, and Pyre was just our biggest game basically in every respect. Our previous games, Bastion and Transistor, are like relatively shorter, just in terms of the time it takes to play through from beginning to end. And Pyre is just kind of like a bigger world and more characters, more ways to play, hundreds of millions of possible ending combinations. Like if you played through to the end, the ending is kind of like highly configured to the particular choices and decisions you make along the way. So there was just kind of a lot of, and not only that, we kind of the whole design of the game isn't really that similar to other games out there, I would say. So just in kind of coming up with what the play experience was going to be like, all that stuff it took us a bunch of time as a relatively small team of about a dozen people. So it's not really any one thing over the course of development. It's just figuring out how all the different pieces are going to fit together.
One thing that I found really interesting that you mentioned was that there hasn't been a game quite like this before, and that's something I think is really apparent, not only, like you said, with the multiple story options and definitely how specific it gets, but also with the gameplay, and that's something that it seems to be pretty apparent in Supergiant Games. Games is the gameplay is usually pretty unique in each game, but with this one, it's kind of like a mixture between NBA Street Jam and well, I don't really know how else to describe it. It's like a 3v3 sports game, kind of. So I want to talk about what's the importance of gameplay. Do you guys try and change it up from game to game, or is it just something that you have an idea and you kind of go with it?
Yeah, so it's been really interesting for us to just kind of explore our limits as a team and explore different types of play. And it really depends on the kind of game we want to make. So with Transistor, our second game, we wanted to take what we had done with our first game, this kind of like action RPG experience in Bastion, and see if we could combine that with a sense of strategic depth, more of like a strategy game feel, even though it had this like pick up and play quality that Bastion had. And as for Pyre, we were really interested in a game that was like a multi-character experience this time, since our first two games were almost these kind of solitary experiences with very small casts of characters. We wanted to do something more of like an ensemble cast, and a game where you could encounter the same adversaries kind of again and again. So the nature of the conflict in the game had to be something where the stakes were high, but not necessarily like lethal. It's not like gladiatorial combat or something like that, where if you kill one of your opponents while they're gone for good, it wouldn't make sense for them to come back in the story. Whereas here, this kind of idea around this mystic competition where the freedom of these various characters was at stake was something that was really interesting to us, because then you could confront these different characters and essentially deny them their chance at being free from this purgatory setting, and that could make the stakes really, really personal in the story in a way that we were excited about and wanted to explore.
And what do you think what experiences did you draw upon to make a story like this? And it's definitely very, very unique. And what do you think the importance of the story is? I know a heavy theme in it is struggle and enlightenment. And so where did you get that message from, and why is it so important?
Yeah, well, that's always, it's always difficult to say too concisely, because it comes from so many different places, or when it comes to the story inspiration and so on. There's aspects, our games take place in these kind of fantastical worlds, or like a cyberpunk world in the case of Transistor, but there's aspects of all of them that are somewhat, always to some extent, like drawing from autobiographical experiences, even though rendered, very indirectly in the case of these worlds. So much of Pyre in particular it's the story essentially about teamwork and a group of characters having to kind of strive together and trust each other and have faith in what they're trying to achieve, even when the going can get really, really bleak. And I think for sure some of our experiences as a team, a small team working together kind of through thick and thin over the years, sometimes through some difficult periods and times of doubt, that has definitely been instructive to my writing in Pyre. But there's also, there's broader themes there as well. This kind of like this test of faith throughout the game that these characters are going through. That's just kind of like synthesizing a lot of my own interests in various kind of world religions and things of that nature. I think all of our games have dealt with like questions of what people kind of what motivates people, what people truly believe in deep down, whether they believe in anything, and so on. Those are questions that are like deeply fascinating to me, just about humanity. How people think and get through things. So I think all of our games have tried to explore them in various ways.
Yeah, and it definitely shows. It's really, really, really fascinating how each game tackles kind of, like you said, a different thing of what are people's beliefs, and as you mentioned, Pyre being something that is so many different characters dealing with this question.
Right.
Something that I want to jump to as well, more on the technical side, because I know you guys said you're a small team, and I know you guys spend a lot of time working on like one thing at a time, and I know that you've had 2 very successful ports to the iOS on the Apple Store, and I was wondering if that's the next step with Pyre, or is that something that you kind of don't see Pyre working for?
Yeah, it's a good question. We don't. The short answer is we don't know yet if we're going to bring Pyre to other platforms. It's been very like case by case for us in the past, just whether the kind of circumstances and opportunity all line up. But yeah, Bastion and Transistor, both. We ended up bringing both those games to iOS, to iPhone and iPad sometime after the initial launch. So it's not anything that we've decided on firmly one way or another when it comes to Pyre. We haven't ruled anything out, but being a small team, like the one of the challenges we often face is just deciding between, do we want to continue working on a previous game, or do we want to move on and make something new? And it's really tough because we want to bring our games to as many different players as we possibly can across whichever platforms where it can make sense and where it's kind of technically feasible for us. And at the same time, we have we feel after working on a certain game for a number of years, where we get filled with the desire to go make something new also. So we always have to weigh that and try to make really smart choices there, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And is it hard to port to an iOS? Because I don't know why I've never really played too many great games on the iOS, but it seems that you guys always have successful ports.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's like really hard to do well, in my opinion. Like particularly on Bastion, which was our first time making a game for like a touch device. Essentially, it was a really big like the number of design changes we had to make the game feel right and feel at home was like very significant. So it took us like 7 months or something on top of the original development time, which we actually made Bastion in less than 2 years flat. So it was a really significant additional amount of development time just to kind of get it to a good spot on iOS, and we learned a lot from that. It was a really interesting process, and we were glad the game was so well received. But the kind of like the usability aspect of making sure the game works well with touch is something that we try to never underestimate how much work that's going to involve to really get that feeling right.
Yeah, sorry, I just like had a moment of like you said something and I got lost in that thought while you're talking about it. I want to talk about, because you mentioning when you're talking about these learning curves and these learning experiences, you yourself have gone through many different jobs before getting Supergiant Games, and one of the main focuses that we do on this podcast and radio show is we want to bring people in to share those experiences with the college campus. Just because we want to show that there's multiple different ways that people go about doing things. So if you could walk me through what led up to the creation of Bastion and this kind of crazy ride that you find yourself in.
Like in terms of my own work experience, or specifically while at Supergiant or leading up to Supergiant?
If you could do leading up to Supergiant, because I think that would be very interesting to go into.
Yeah. So I've been in game development now for a little over 10 years, but and something like 7 or 8 of those are at Supergiant. But prior to that, I wrote about game. I was a game critic and an editor, mostly at a publication called GameSpot, for a good long time. So I was at GameSpot for 10 years between 1996, which was basically like my first. I started as an intern, practically fresh out of high school, and then I worked there all the way until the beginning of 2007, by which point I was editor-in-chief there. So I started writing about games in high school. I wanted to make games since I was a little kid, but my attempts to teach myself programming were always kind of unsuccessful, let's say. Whereas I really enjoyed writing, and I was playing lots and lots of games, and wanted to put myself in a position where I could, better justify all the time I was spending just playing games. So I enjoyed, having to put on a critical thinking cap, as it were, and write about them critically that way. And it led to some small gigs, and led to that GameSpot internship. And so that is like the first 10 years of my career, essentially. But I never lost sight of wanting to make games one day, work on them, despite really falling in love with the press side of things. And so one day, when a former colleague of mine mentioned that they're looking for a producer to work on the Command & Conquer series of real-time strategy games, which I was a fan of, down in Electronic Arts in Los Angeles, I got that. I applied for that position and got it. So that was when I first started working on games. That's actually where I met the two of the guys who then went on to become the co-founders of Supergiant, where I work now. So I worked at EA for close to 3 years, we released several games in that time, all real-time strategy games. After that, I worked at 2K Games for a year on a shooter called Spec Ops: The Line, and then I reunited with my former EA colleagues at Supergiant, and we made Bastion and Transistor and Pyre. So that's that's fast forwarding through a bunch of different stuff, but I've definitely been able to see. I think I've had like a pretty unique experience actually in terms of being able to see the game industry from a lot of different angles, both the kind of the press side, and then at a very big publisher like Electronic Arts down to a very small independent studio like Supergiant. So not only has it been interesting to see the game industry sort of change and evolve over the years just naturally, it's been interesting to view through the lens of these different kinds of companies. And not to mention the part where I've gotten to do a lot of different types of work, but it's finally here at Supergiant after all this time that I got to do writing and design work on games in a very, very hands-on way, which is kind of finally fulfilling that childhood dream of mine from when I was 8 years old or so.
What are some of your favorite games as a kid?
Man, I liked all kinds of different stuff. I was always I was very fortunate to have access to computers in addition to consoles. So I played computer games and like console games and arcade games as well, kind of with similar levels of devotion. So the games I always credit as like my all-time favorite games, and they're both very old at this point, but they were formative experiences for me. One was an old computer role-playing game called Ultima 5. So the Ultima series is like, I think basically every like big Western open world role-playing game, whether it's like The Witcher or Elder Scrolls or any game like that, owes a lot to Ultima from the late 80s and early 90s. So the Ultima series and Ultima 5 in particular was just kind of like a mind-boggling experience for me in terms of the freedom and the choice and the depth of the story and world that it afforded. And then the other big one for me is Street Fighter 2. I absolutely loved and continue to love fighting games, and most of my high school years, revolved. A lot of my high school experience revolved around fighting games. Back then, there were when arcades and stuff were still prevalent, or you could go to like what's it called, like a convenience store or whatever. They just have like a Street Fighter 2 machine in there. So I played lots and lots of Street Fighter. So I always loved games both from the kind of like mechanics side of it, which I think is like really exemplified in fighting games with their very intricate gameplay, and then their ability to tell stories and give the player a ton of freedom as in role-playing games like Ultima 5. So I've kind of liked everything in between as well.
That's really fascinating, because now that I was thinking about it, because it's Street Fighter 2, and I was like, I'm a huge fan of Street Fighter as well. I was like, how does he incorporate that, into his games, and like how does that influence like what he does and stuff? And it definitely shows with the mechanics, like you said, maybe not necessarily the specific fighting genre mechanic, but the focus on that itself.
It's also I try to work fighting game stuff into everything I do. Actually, it's a very not everyone I work with is as kind of loves this fighting. It has the background in fighting games quite like I do. So it's obviously our games are like not directly similar to fighting games in any way. But for me personally, there's a ton of spiritual influence there, not just in the design, but even in things like the character design. Like I think fighting games are actually sort of underappreciated as a storytelling genre, but I think they've done incredibly efficient work in terms of their story, just because their characters are like loaded with story, really. And certain fighting games, their characters are so iconic and so well designed. Their personalities are so crisp that I just really admire that. So when I think of characters for the worlds of our games, I very frequently tap into some of my kind of fighting game favorites from over the years as influences.
I can definitely relate to that because growing up, I played a lot of Marvel vs. Capcom 2, which is my favorite fighting game.
Yeah.
And the character designs, like, I mean, I used to spend like hours just looking up, like you said, just like the characters themselves because it seemed like they were so well thought out.
Yeah.
And one game that's really, really big on my school campus right now and really just in the world is Dragon Ball FighterZ.
Yeah.
You've been enjoying that?
Yeah. Absolutely. It's like those guys, that team over there, Arc System Works. I don't know what's in the water over there, but they've been doing like incredible. I mean, their work has been amazing to me over the last few years. Like whatever just the look of that game is just completely staggering. I think like they've achieved what so many other developers have been completely unable to do for years and years and years, which is like capture the frenzy of one of those like you know classic Dragon Ball Z episodes in the form of a game where you're actually in control. You're not just kind of watching a cartoon. You're really playing it. You're really embodying those characters, and they've done it with incredible skill. And they've made it quite a bit. I think fighting games they can have kind of an accessibility problem, right? Like people like you and I can still love that genre, but we've been playing games like that for years, and it can be really difficult to get into that style of game because they're built on years and years of like pre-existing knowledge, and I think expect a lot of that pre-existing knowledge on behalf of players. But something like Dragon Ball FighterZ looks so amazing that I think new players they see that and they want to learn it, which I think is great. So I love that fighting games are still going strong after all these years.
Yeah, I mean, I have a friend who he's never watched Dragon Ball, and he is the only fighting game he plays is Injustice, and he got really into that.
Cool.
But he came over and he sat down and he started watching the game, and he was like, "This is the most beautiful game I've ever seen."
Yeah,
and like that's.
I think that's like a very that is like not an exaggeration around that. It's like that impressive.
Yeah, and it reflected because like you said with the accessibility, I was thinking about this too. Was that they took? It seems like they were inspired, or maybe not. They just have similar mindsets of a Skullgirls, because that game seemed pretty accessible to me as a fighting game, with the very easy to learn combos but hard to master, gameplay.
Yeah, and those games are all speaking of Marvel versus Capcom. It's like a whole kind of offshoot, right? Dragon Ball FighterZ is still very much in that same vein with like the multi-character. Picking multiple characters and assists and all that kind of stuff. So it's interesting how there are all these like for an older genre like the fighting game that it's kind of spun off into these many different offshoots that each are very very intricate like that. But yeah, I don't know how I love that they're despite like working in game development now for however long I have, I can still look at some of these games and just still be completely bewildered as to like I have a vague sense of what they must have done in order to create that game, but not really. It still feels like magic to me, just like when I was a kid, playing Street Fighter 2 or something like that. So I love that games can continue to provide that kind of feeling for me after all this time.
That's so good to know, because I feel like so many people have those feelings when they play games, and I read so much about people who make movies. I think Quentin Tarantino said he just stopped watching movies, and I was like, I thought that, I mean, he probably still does, but he just overall watches like a movie every once in a while, and it's good to know that you're still, like you said, have that childlike view of like this game is amazing and how did they make this. What are some other games out recently that you've been like, what, and definitely have been something that keeps you wanting to be in the industry?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot. Like, you know, it's funny because I always have the one. What am I trying to say? There's just always so much, really, which keeps you very grounded because you can. There's so many impressive games all the time, but like another one I've been playing a lot recently is called Into the Breach. It just came out a couple of weeks ago. It's a turn-based strategy game from the team that made FTL way back when, which was like a sort of a science fiction disaster scenario simulator, as I would describe it. But FTL was a really amazing game, I thought, a few years back, of just trying to like run a small spaceship through hostile space, and it just felt like being on a Star Trek episode or something like that, where everything is just going terribly wrong and you're trying to get through it. But their new game, Into the Breach, is so, like, the design, it has a level of elegance to it that I think that is just very uncommon. It's so streamlined and kind of efficient in how it's designed. And I've been, you know, I got my start making strategy games down at EA, so I'm always interested to see how different designers can approach it. And their central idea with Into the Breach I found so fascinating, which was that, you know, what if you had a strategy game where you basically like knew everything that was going to happen, everything that your opponent was going to do? How would you then, you know, still make that challenging? And the way it's borne out in that game is really just outstandingly done, I think. Whereas so many strategy games rely on like randomness and not really knowing exactly what your enemy is going to do. And Into the Breach, every single enemy basically telegraphs its moves, so you know that they're going to attack this unit or try to destroy this building or something like that. And your turn becomes, what are you going to do about it? And how do you kind of spread your resources around the field to stop it? But it's really easy to learn. It's really hard to master all that kind of like sort of all that stuff that you want out of a truly great strategy game. So I think that game, it's similar to FTL. It's not like it's not visually as stunning as like a Dragon Ball Fighters or something like that, but it only takes a few minutes of playing it to see that it's very special, like from a design standpoint.
I mean, it's a testament to the game developers as well, because my friend, he played their first game, FTL. I haven't played any of their games, and I plan on it, but he's the type of guy who he doesn't really play video games a lot. He had trouble getting off the first island in Kingdom Hearts. Like, you know what I mean? Like, he's just not video game inclined. Which actually, he was my boss for a while, so he'll hear this soon. But he played FTL, and he played it twice. You know what I mean? He beat it, and then he beat it again, like in his first year of college.
That's one of those games where I feel like people, you know, for some people, they just played it like for years after it came out. It was that engrossing to people, and that like its design was that open-ended that you could just kind of keep playing it over and over and over and never really experience the exact same scenario twice in a row. So it just kept it infinitely interesting. And that's true, you know, that's why it's like, what's the ultimate strategy game? It's chess, right? It's like people have been playing chess, or maybe it's not chess, it might be Go or something like that, but there are a couple of strategy games out there that have been played for literally thousands of years, and so it's a pretty high bar to strive for, but some of these games, like FDL and Into the Breach, sometimes I wonder they come perilously close to being just that, like, infinitely interesting. I still play. I should also, speaking of that, I still play Hearthstone all the time.
Oh,
the Blizzard's card game. I've been playing Hearthstone for 4 years now. It's actually a little bit disturbing to me. I don't know that I've ever, you know, even with Street Fighter, it's like there would be new fighting games that would come out that would kind of take over my life. But with Hearthstone, I'm stuck with the same game for much longer than I normally would.
Yeah, I mean, I have several friends and even relatives who just fell down the Hearthstone hole and haven't come
Yeah.
out.
Yep.
And I mean, I can't blame them. I'm stuck in an Overwatch hole constantly. It's just Blizzard, I think. But have you gotten any? Has any fans reached out to you, or have you felt yourself that you've kind of hit that level of like people playing a game and being so engrossed that they're like, I need to play it again? Or is it something that you still feel like you're striving for?
Well, our games are less designed around like infinite replayability, right? At least thus far. Like they're made to be the kinds of games where you can finish them and then kind of go on with your life. Though for sure I think for me it's definitely one of the things that like keeps me going when times get tough. But we hear really regularly, and we're very very grateful for this from our players who've been very kind of moved by our games. Thankfully, with Pyre most recently, but with Transistor and Bastion before it, and hearing from players all across the world about how much our games have meant to them. And sometimes we hear from folks who tell us things like, I was really struggling. It was a really difficult time in my life, and then I came across one of your games, and it's really helped change my outlook and get me to a better place. And they express their gratitude around that, and it's incredibly moving for us, because that's obviously not something that we can expect for. That's not an effect that we can expect for our games to be able to have on people, but it's really important to us to make games that have a potential to leave like a lasting and positive impression on players. So when we do hear it, it makes us very happy, because we do make conscious choices about the kind of media that we create, the kind of tone and atmosphere that it has, the kind of message that it may send, and so for players to tell us that our games have had like a positive impact on their lives, really, really means a lot, for sure, and suggests to us that we're hopefully on the right track with what we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think you guys are.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. It's. I remember. Yeah, I started with Bastion when I saw the trailer for Transistor. I was like, okay, well, I got to play their first game, because the trailer, like, I don't know what you guys did with it, but it made me watch it like 80 times. Like, I don't know, it was just so cool, and my brother and I just kept watching it and watching it. I was like, this is going to show how young I am, but I think I was like 15 at the time when that trailer came out, and I beat Bastion. I kept telling my friends to play it. None of them did until like this year, because they don't listen to me.
Better late than never.
Yeah, exactly. That's like, I finally got my friend Andrew, and he's like, this is like one of the best games ever, and I'm like, I know, but it was Transistor that really struck a chord with me, and I mean, so much so that like GIFs over the past few years have been like artwork and like soundtracks and stuff from that game. So yeah, it's definitely something that I've talked to other people about, and with myself personally, it's resonated. And I think one of the biggest things is not only the story and the character design, but eventually we're going to get on this topic anyway, is the music.
Yeah.
The music is, I mean, I've heard good video game music. You know what I mean? Like, I've played Nintendo. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I know. I played all these other games where it's like almost feels like the spine of the game. It's like what it keeps it, like, I don't know, or something. I don't know how to describe it. And you guys just did it, and I hadn't experienced it in so long until I had played your games again. And so, how does that even work? Do you guys, does Darren, who is the person who makes the music for your games?
Yeah.
I don't know why I said like, of course you know, but is he sitting there along with you guys with the story and writing the music along with that? Does he play the game a little bit? Like, how does that even happen?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for that, and the music in our games, and it has been a really important part of each one, despite whatever differences from game to game. It's something that we know is just going to be so impactful in terms of setting the appropriate tone and just like creating the kind of mood through the story that we're going for, that we've just always felt that the music in our games could have a tremendous amount of potential. And it's thanks to Darren Korb, our composer, who's worked on each of our games, that and I think we've really managed to get there. Though for sure it's made possible sort of twofold. One is that we're working with someone with Darren's talent, and he really does extraordinary work. I think I'm a big fan of the stuff he makes, and it warms my heart when other people enjoy it too. But the other part of it is that we do take it very seriously from a development standpoint. So Darren is there, in-house, working on our game from the start, as opposed to in some scenarios where like the music can be outsourced maybe to like a very talented composer, but it's still, if the music is going to come in like in the last 6 months of development or something like that, then how much can the music truly do for that experience? Whereas with us, like a lot of the when we're thinking about the story of the game and key moments throughout the experience, the music is always at the forefront of our minds, and we're working with Darren often very early on in the process on some of those moments. So we just put the time and focus into it, which I think really helps give it the opportunity to shine. And then Darren thankfully sees to it that it sounds as good as it does. But yeah, I think we're gonna. It's just something that I think we're always gonna take very seriously, so long as we continue to value all the stuff that we do when it comes to our games.
And I don't want to make too grandiose of a comparison for Darren, because he's very talented. But to me, he's kind of like the John Williams of these games, because it's that.
He'd appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, I hope, because like
as a huge Star Wars nerd, he would be very grateful for that.
I'm glad, because I'm such a huge Star Wars nerd. I'm a huge John Williams fan. You know what I mean? I listen to his stuff. Yeah. The Superman soundtrack gets me every time. But where did you find him? And what was he doing before this?
Yeah, so he goes. So Amir, I mentioned I met the co-founders of Supergiant while working at EA. So they are Amir Rao and Gavin Simon, and a lot of the team at Supergiant is basically connected to Amir one way or another. Like either we worked with them at EA, or in the case of Darren, they played soccer together in middle school. So they've known each other since they were kids. And it's actually the same. It's the same deal with Logan Cunningham, who has been the principal voice actor in all our games. So he's the narrator in Bastion. And he's the voice of the Transistor and Transistor, and he's the main voice you hear in the rights in Pyre. So Amir and Darren and Logan have all known each other since they were little kids, and Darren and Logan had no previous experience working on video games prior to Supergiant forming, when Amir basically contacted them and said, "Hey, we're going to need Darren. Like, we don't have any audio in our game, and we could probably use some sound effects and music. Do you think you could lend us a hand?" And then similarly with Logan, we knew of his talent as an actor and thought maybe we could do some stuff with voiceover to see how that goes. And kind of the rest is history when it came to Bastion, and the narration being one of the standout qualities in that game, I think.
That's the dream team right there. I mean, I don't know how many times do you hear stories like that where it's like, yeah, we were kids and we grew up and then we make something really awesome, and it's like, it always seems to go that way. And I had the voice actor. I didn't know there was the same guy from each game. I thought you guys got a different guy from the narrator from Bastion to Transistor.
Yeah, no, it's him each time. Logan has an amazing. He actually plays many characters in Pyre. Some of the other voices that you hear as well. But our whole thing is we want to make games based on the talents that we have at our disposal. If that makes sense. Like, I think a lot of teams out there, they'll dream up the game they want to make, and they'll start hiring people to try to make that game. And for us, it's just been more about what can we do with what we already have. When we were starting small with Bastion, it's just got up to 7 people by the end. we had to be really like in some ways keep our ideas as constrained as possible and kind of as grounded as possible. So yeah, these really key aspects of the game, like the narration, they really came largely from the availability of, you know, someone with a great, like if we didn't know Logan, we probably would have never pursued narration for a game like Bastion at all, which is kind of wild to think about, but is very true to our development process.
I think this is a good point to take a break. I was supposed to do one earlier, but I got so into listening to you that I completely forgot. So we're gonna go ahead and take like a short break, and we'll have a song and a word from our sponsors, and we'll be right back. This hour is sponsored by Spinnaker.com. Stay up to date with all your local and UNF news on our student-run website. Stream our radio station, watch weekly TV content, and keep up to date with top headlines at Spinnaker.com.
What's been happening in your world? What have you been up to? I heard that you fell in love. I near enough. I gotta tell you the truth. Yeah. I wanna grab both shoulders and shake, baby. Snap out of it. I get the feeling I left it too late, but baby, snap out of it. If that watch don't continue to swing, I'll a fat lady fancies having a thing. I'll be here waiting ever so patiently for you to snap out of it. Everyone is forever for you. It sounds like settling down, giving up, but it don't sound much like you, girl. I wanna grab both your shoulders and shake, baby, snap out of it. I get the feeling I left it too late, but baby, snap out of it. If that watch don't continue to swing, I'm a fat lady fancies having a sing. I'll be here waiting ever so patiently for you to snap out of it. Spell your hypnotized. Darling, how could you be so blind? Snap out. Under a spell, you're hypnotized. Darling, how could you be so blind? I wanna grab both your shoulders and shake, baby, snap out of it. I get the feeling I left it too late, but baby, snap out of it. If that watch don't continue to swing, I'm a fat lady fancies having a thing. I'll be here waiting ever so patiently for you to snap out of it.
Okay, and we're back, and we just got done talking about the importance of music and narration in Supergiant Games, and how that kind of has come together, and using the talents of the small team and the strengths of having a small team. I actually checked the website several times when I first started getting your games to see how big the team was, and I kept going like, wait, there's no way, like, because I've definitely, all the games that I've played, the credits go on for like 10 minutes, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
For how many people work on a game, and and that's something that's really, really inspired my older brother and I whenever we're working on stuff. Is we look at these small teams that are able to pull off these really kind of gargantuan, bigger than life projects. And so for this last part of the interview, I was wondering if you could give any advice on what it's like to work with a team, what it's like to get down on that individual level with someone else, because I think that's something that's really important, and a lot of people don't learn till later on.
Yeah. So it is. I definitely agree. It's really important. The thing about learning to collaborate well is it seems vitally important almost no matter what you do, no matter on what scale. Because even if you're working with, whether you're working with 2 people or hundreds of people, your ability to sort of work effectively with them is going to have a huge influence over probably your own sense of contentment toward that work and the quality of the result and everything else. There are some rare people out there who have the ability to make games almost entirely on their own. There's a game a few years ago called Papers, Please.
Oh, yes.
That I thought was an extraordinary, just an incredible game that was made essentially by one person. But, you know, a person who did the art and the coding and the design and everything. But it's almost never that happens anymore. And even like smaller independent games are still made by teams of, you know, 4 to 20 or 30 people or something like that. The team sizes, I think, have gotten bigger somewhat over the years. So you have to be effective as part of a team, and I think just you know, I don't know that there's any super broad advice about how to achieve that is useful, other than just like being aware of it. But so much of my own experience through like trying to get into game development is just about trying to identify those places where I can be useful to a team. And for me, early on, you know, when I was getting started at EA, it was just like finding the work that had to get done that nobody wanted to do, and being eager to do that work for its own sake, because you know, both because it had to get done and because I liked it. So to give an example of that, like back then in 2007, games still had, at least some games still had instruction manuals, right? You open the box and there's an instruction manual about how to play. I was like very excited to be able to write something like that when no one particularly wanted to. So it was a good fit, and I was able to make myself useful around something like that. And then, you know, as when you're part of a team and you have a good attitude toward your work and you're getting stuff done, more opportunities start to present themselves, I think.
I completely agree. I think one of the things that I always found helpful, like you said, is the eagerness of doing work that no one wants to do. It's not necessarily of just doing the work. It's definitely showing the initiative. Is there any other advice that you would give to not just game developers, because I definitely think there are a lot of people out there who want to make games, but anyone looking for a creative endeavor? What's something that's other than teamwork and eagerness that you would give?
Yeah, so the other, I think this type of, I think a lot of people have observed some version of the following, which is just like, if you want to do creative work, no one is going to sort of hand that to you on a silver platter. You have to just start doing it. You have to make time for it and kind of get it out of your system that way. And I see this a lot. I think it's a common dilemma among probably in other creative fields as well, but in the game industry, there are like entry-level people who want to get into game design or who want to just start working on game teams, but they don't have previous experience. And they experience like they run into this catch-22 where they start looking around for jobs, and all of the jobs require past experience. And they're like, how do I get into this? Because how do I get the experience if I don't have the job? And it sounds like a paradox. And unfortunately, it is a bit of a paradox, admittedly. But what some people are able to do is they just start doing it on their own, extracurricularly. You could pick up, Unity or Game Maker or even something like Twine, and just, if you want to start making games, you could just start making them. You could start teaching yourself. And it takes, an internet connection and a bunch of time, but it doesn't necessarily cost a lot, like it once did. So the barrier to entry, as far as like getting started, either making games or making movies or making music, just whatever you want, I think it's never been lower historically than it is now. The consequence of that is that you're competing with the world's talent pool. There's always going to be someone like way better than you at anything that you think you're even remotely good at, and that's like I think we all struggle with that. It's whether we're playing Dragon Ball Fighters and experiencing how we're never going to be the best fighting game player in the world, or whether we're doing creative work. Whether I'm doing work as a writer or as a game designer. There's just always someone out there who is younger and more talented, probably. So you just have to, you have to internalize that and still just find the right balance of specializing, like becoming very good in the discipline that you very care about, but also trying to broaden your knowledge always and just be a well-rounded person. And I don't know that there's like a best way to do this. It's really, really hard. I think it's hard for everybody, but the sense that it's hard for everybody is something that I think, brings people together in a way in this industry. Like, a lot of people can relate to the hardships involved in game development, and a lot of people can relate to the struggle to try to get in and start doing it, and it's just hard, and you have to power through it, and it's not necessarily for everybody, but it's never been easier to find out whether it's right for you, at least. And like I said, while I'm speaking, somewhat specifically to game development, I suppose a lot of that might be true to other, like to being a musician, or to being a writer, or to being an actor, what have you. It's just the nature of trying to do creative work in the year 2018, right? But if it's something that is like a part of you and something that you really care about, you have to. You're doing it because you feel like you have to do it, not because you expect it to like become your profession or something. So ideally, you could still find a way to do it, for the creative fulfillment of it. If not, and then if it could turn into paying work, so much the better. But it's it requires a lot of I think getting lucky along the way, to be honest, and that could be a tough pill to swallow. But yeah, I myself feel very, very just incredibly lucky that I've been in the right place at the right time, I guess, enough times in my life to be able to do this stuff for a living. But I wanted to make games since I was 8 years old, and it wasn't until I was close to 30 that I got my first shot. So it can take a while. I guess that's what I would end with.
I'm sorry. I
Yeah.
thought you were still talking.
Yeah.
My bad.
Yeah.
For a second, I thought there was an audio problem. But I just want to thank you so much for coming on here.
Yeah.
That's all I got for you, and that's all the time we have. It's definitely been really fantastic getting to hear about your experiences, the company's experiences, and the game's development throughout the past year of it coming out. I hope the best for you, and I hope you know, you guys figure out what you're gonna do next, and it's not too crazy, and you had a good break. But thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you.